Ma'am, who are you and what are you doing in this house?
This is my home. What seems to be the problem?
We got reports of suspicious activity. I need your ID.
On what legal basis?
Just cooperate. Ma'am.
The morning coffee was still steaming when Judge Patricia Williams heard the commotion outside her front door. She had been preparing for another day on the federal bench, reviewing case files for the afternoon sentencing hearing. The sound of heavy footsteps on her porch made her pause. Then came the aggressive knocking that would change everything. What happened next would destroy 2 police careers, send shockwaves through the justice system, and prove that even those who wear the robes of justice are not immune to the ugliest forms of prejudice. The body camera footage from that Tuesday morning would rack up over 25 million views, spark congressional hearings, and result in the harshest penalties ever imposed for racial profiling in her state's history. Judge Patricia Williams was no ordinary target. At 52 years old, she had spent the last decade as a federal judge appointed by the president himself. Before that, she served 8 years as a district attorney, prosecuting some of the most complex criminal cases in the region. Her reputation was spotless. Her record on the bench was respected by attorneys on both sides of the courtroom. She lived quietly in an upscale neighborhood, drove a modest sedan, and was known by neighbors as the woman who organized the annual block party and helped elderly residents with their groceries. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Judge Williams had woken early, gone for her usual jog through the tree-lined streets of her subdivision, and returned home to prepare for work. She lived in a beautiful colonial house she had purchased 3 years earlier, complete with manicured lawn and flower beds. She tended herself on weekends. Nothing about her routine suggested drama or confrontation. At exactly 7:23 in the morning, officers Daniel Reeves and Marcus Thompson pulled into her driveway. They were responding to what they claimed was a suspicious person report. Someone had allegedly called about a black woman who didn't belong in the neighborhood, someone who had been seen entering and leaving the house at strange hours. The problem was that no such call had ever been made. What actually happened was this. Officer Reeves had been driving through the upscale neighborhood on routine patrol when he spotted Judge Williams returning from her morning jog. Something about seeing a successful black woman in athletic wear, clearly comfortable in this affluent area, triggered something in his mind. He radioed his partner Thompson with a fabricated story about a suspicious person report and requested backup. This decision would prove to be the most expensive mistake of both their careers. Judge Williams answered her front door still wearing her silk robe, coffee mug in hand. She expected to see a neighbor or perhaps a delivery person. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with 2 uniformed police officers, both with their hands resting on their belts in an aggressive stance. Officer Reeves immediately demanded to know who she was and what she was doing in the house. Judge Williams, confused but maintaining her composure, asked if there was some kind of problem. Reeves ignored her question and repeated his demand for identification. When she asked why they were at her door, Thompson stepped forward and said they had received reports about suspicious activity at this address. This is where Judge Williams made a decision that would prove brilliant. Instead of immediately revealing her position as a federal judge, she decided to see how these officers would treat someone they perceived as having no power or status. She calmly told them this was her home and asked what specific suspicious activity had been reported. The officers couldn't provide specifics because there had been no actual report. Reeves stammered something about someone not belonging in the neighborhood. Thompson added that they needed to verify she had a right to be there. When Judge Williams asked if they had a warrant or any legal authority to demand entry into her home, both officers became visibly agitated. Officer Reeves told her that her attitude was suspicious and that cooperative citizens wouldn't ask so many questions. Thompson warned her that obstruction could lead to arrest. Judge Williams remained calm but firm, stating that she was simply exercising her constitutional rights in her own home. That's when Officer Reeves made his second catastrophic mistake. He pushed past Judge Williams and entered her house without permission, claiming he needed to check for other occupants. Thompson followed, both officers now illegally inside a federal judge's private residence. Judge Williams did not resist, but she clearly stated that they were entering without consent and without a warrant. She pulled out her phone and began recording. The moment that camera came out, Officer Reeves exploded. He demanded she stop recording immediately. When she refused, he grabbed for her phone. What these officers didn't know was that Judge Williams had installed a high-end security system just 6 months earlier. Every angle of her front porch, living room, and kitchen was being recorded in high definition with crystal clear audio. Every illegal entry, every violation of her rights, every word they spoke was being captured and automatically uploaded to cloud storage. The footage would later show Officer Reeves snatching the phone from Judge Williams' hands and throwing it across the room. It would show Thompson searching through her personal belongings without any legal justification. It would capture them demanding she prove she lived there while they stood illegally in her own living room. But the most damaging footage was yet to come. When Judge Williams asked for their badge numbers and the name of their supervisor, Officer Reeves lost complete control. The racial slurs that poured out of his mouth next would end his career and land him in federal prison. Thompson, rather than stopping his partner, joined in with his own disgusting commentary about people who didn't know their place. They told her that fancy houses and expensive neighborhoods weren't for people like her. They said she was probably dealing drugs or prostituting herself to afford a mortgage. They used language so vile and hateful that when the footage was eventually played in court, several jurors visibly recoiled. Judge Williams endured this abuse for nearly 20 minutes, documenting everything while maintaining remarkable composure. She never once raised her voice or responded with anger. She simply repeated her requests for their badge numbers and supervisor contact information. When the officers finally finished their illegal search and found nothing because there was nothing to find, they prepared to leave. But Officer Reeves wasn't done. He told Judge Williams that if he ever saw her in this neighborhood again, she would be arrested for trespassing. He said the homeowner, whoever it was, would be contacted and told about the suspicious black woman trying to break into their house. That's when Judge Williams finally revealed who she was. She walked to her home office, retrieved her judicial credentials, and placed them on the coffee table in front of both officers. The look on their faces when they realized they had just spent 20 minutes racially abusing a federal judge in her own home would become legendary among law enforcement training circles. Officer Reeves went pale. Officer Thompson started backing toward the door. Both men suddenly found themselves unable to speak. Judge Williams calmly informed them that everything they had just done was recorded, that they had violated multiple federal laws, and that she would be filing complaints with every relevant authority before the day was over. Have you ever seen someone's entire world collapse in real time? Drop a comment if you've witnessed a moment like that. The officers practically ran from her house, but the damage was already done. 23 minutes of footage showing 2 police officers committing multiple felonies against a federal judge. The evidence was ironclad. The violations were clear, and the consequences would be swift and devastating. But Judge Williams was just getting started. Within 30 minutes of the officers leaving her property, Judge Williams was on the phone with the FBI. As a federal judge, she had direct access to the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, and they took her call immediately. She provided a preliminary account of what had occurred and informed them that she had comprehensive video evidence of multiple federal crimes. The FBI agent who took her call was Special Agent Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who specialized in police misconduct cases. Santos had prosecuted dozens of civil rights violations, but she had never heard of anything quite like this. 2 local police officers had just committed federal crimes against a sitting federal judge in her own home, and it was all captured on video. Agent Santos arrived at Judge Williams' house within 2 hours, accompanied by a technical specialist and a civil rights prosecutor. They spent 4 hours reviewing the security footage, taking detailed statements, and documenting every aspect of the incident. The prosecutor, David Chun, kept shaking his head as he watched the video. In his 15 years of prosecuting police misconduct, he had rarely seen evidence this clear or violations this egregious. Meanwhile, Officers Reeves and Thompson returned to their precinct in a state of panic. They knew they had made a catastrophic mistake, but they weren't sure how catastrophic until they started researching exactly who Judge Patricia Williams was. What they discovered made their situation infinitely worse. Judge Williams wasn't just any federal judge. She was a chief judge of the federal district court, meaning she oversaw all federal criminal cases in the region. She had presided over hundreds of police misconduct cases during her tenure. She had sentenced corrupt officers, approved search warrants, and ruled on constitutional violations. Her knowledge of federal law was encyclopedic, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to constitutional violations. Officer Reeves called in sick for the rest of the week. Officer Thompson requested emergency vacation time. Both men hired lawyers with money they didn't have, desperately hoping they could somehow contain the damage. They couldn't. By Thursday morning, the story had broken nationally. A federal judge had been racially profiled and illegally searched in her own home by local police officers. The video footage, which Judge Williams had authorized for release, was being played on every major news network. Legal experts were calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of police misconduct ever recorded. The police chief, Robert Martinez, held an emergency press conference that same afternoon. He announced that both officers had been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. He called their actions inexcusable and promised that the department would cooperate fully with federal authorities. But his words rang hollow to a public that had heard similar promises countless times before. What made this case different wasn't just the clear evidence or the high-profile victim. It was what happened next that would send shock waves through law enforcement nationwide. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't just investigate the incident. They launched a comprehensive review of the entire police department's practices. They subpoenaed records going back 5 years. They interviewed dozens of officers and civilians. They analyzed arrest patterns, complaint files, and internal communications. What they found was a pattern of racial profiling that went far beyond two rogue officers. The data revealed that black residents in affluent neighborhoods were stopped and questioned at rates 17 times higher than white residents. Internal emails showed supervisors making jokes about certain types of people not belonging in nice areas. Training materials contained coded language that essentially taught officers to view successful black citizens as inherently suspicious. Officer Reeves, it turned out, had a history over the previous 3 years. He had received 12 complaints for racial profiling. All had been dismissed or resulted in minor discipline, like verbal warnings. One complaint came from a black neurosurgeon who had been stopped while jogging in his own neighborhood. Another came from a black family who had been questioned while loading groceries into their car outside their own home. Officer Thompson's record was similarly troubling. 9 complaints in 4 years, all following the same pattern. Both officers had been protected by a system that prioritized loyalty over accountability. And now that system was about to collapse. The federal grand jury was convened within 3 weeks, the fastest turnaround in the district's history. 18 citizens heard testimony from Judge Williams, reviewed the security footage, and listened to expert witnesses explain exactly which federal laws had been violated. The deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. The indictments were devastating. Officer Reeves faced 7 federal charges, including civil rights violations under color of law, illegal search and seizure, criminal trespass, assault, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Each charge carried potential prison time, with the civil rights violations alone punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. Officer Thompson faced 6 similar charges. Even though he hadn't initiated the contact, his participation in the illegal search and his failure to stop his partner's obvious misconduct made him equally culpable under federal law. But the charges against individual officers were just the beginning. The Department of Justice announced that the entire police department would be placed under federal oversight. A consent decree would govern their operations for the next 5 years, with every policy and procedure subject to federal approval. The cost of this oversight would run into millions of dollars, all paid from the city's budget. The financial implications hit immediately. The city's insurance company can lead their police liability coverage, citing the federal investigation as evidence of systemic problems. Without insurance, the city faced potential bankruptcy if they lost civil lawsuits. The mayor called emergency budget meetings as legal fees began mounting. Judge Williams, meanwhile, returned to her courtroom, but she didn't remain silent about what had happened to her. She used her position and her platform to speak about the experience, giving interviews to major news outlets and testifying before congressional committees about the need for police reform. Her message was simple but powerful. If this could happen to a federal judge in her own home, what was happening to ordinary citizens who didn't have her resources, her knowledge of the law, or her ability to fight back? How many people had suffered similar violations but lacked the evidence or the platform to seek justice? The answer to that question would soon become clear as more victims began coming forward, emboldened by seeing a federal judge take a stand. The floodgates were about to open, and the consequences would extend far beyond two disgraced officers, grace officers. The civil lawsuits began filing within days of the criminal indictments. Judge Williams hired the most aggressive civil rights attorney in the state, Rebecca Martinez, who had built her career destroying police departments that thought they were above the law. Martinez filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking $15 million in damages, and she had the evidence to get every penny. But Judge Williams wasn't the only one seeking justice. Once the story went national, her phone started ringing with calls from people who had experienced similar treatment from these same officers. The law firm set up a hotline, and within 2 weeks they had documented 43 separate incidents involving officers Reeves and Thompson. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating. A black pediatrician had been handcuffed outside the hospital where she worked because Thompson claimed she looked suspicious walking to her car after a late shift. A successful businessman had been forced to prove he owned his Mercedes while pumping gas because Reeves insisted someone like him couldn't afford such a vehicle. A college professor had been questioned for 20 minutes about whether she really lived in her neighborhood because both officers happened to see her getting her mail. Every single incident followed the same pattern. Successful black citizens going about their daily lives targeted for no reason other than the color of their skin and the assumption that they didn't belong where they were found. Most had filed complaints that disappeared into the department's internal system without consequence. The federal prosecutor, David Chun, realized he wasn't just dealing with two road cops. This was a systematic pattern of civil rights violations that had been ignored and enabled by department leadership. He expanded the investigation to include supervisors who had dismissed obvious complaints and administrators who had allowed the pattern to continue. Do you think this kind of behavior happens more often than we realize? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The trial of officers Reeves and Thompson began 6 months after the incident at Judge Williams' home. The courthouse was packed with media, civil rights activists, and members of the community who had been waiting years for accountability. The defendants sat at separate tables with their high-priced attorneys, both looking like men who knew their lives were effectively over. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. They played the security footage from Judge Williams' home system, crystal clear video that showed every moment of illegal entry and search. They played audio of the racial slurs and threats. They presented evidence of the fabricated suspicious person report that had never actually been made. Judge Williams testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She walked the jury through every moment of that morning, explaining how her constitutional rights had been violated and describing the fear she felt when armed officers invaded her home. She spoke about the humiliation of being told she didn't belong in her own neighborhood and the anger she felt listening to racial slurs in her own living room. Her testimony was calm, professional, and utterly damning. Here was a federal judge, someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, describing how two officers had trampled on everything she stood for. The jury hung on every word. The defense attorneys tried desperately to find some angle that would save their clients. Reeves' lawyer argued that his client had been following his training and responding to what he genuinely believed was a suspicious situation. The argument fell apart when prosecutors showed that no suspicious person report had ever been made, and that Reeves had admitted to fabricating the initial reason for contact. Thompson's attorney tried to claim his client was just following his partner's lead and hadn't understood the full scope of what was happening. That defense crumbled when prosecutors played audio of Thompson actively participating in the racial abuse and illegal search. The most damaging testimony came from former officers who had worked with both defendants. 3 retired cops took the stand to describe a culture of racism within the department and specific incidents where they had witnessed Reeves and Thompson targeting black citizens. One former sergeant testified that he had tried to report concerns about both officers, but had been told by supervisors to mind his own business. Expert witnesses explained the legal standards for police conduct and detailed exactly how every action taken by the defendants violated federal law. A constitutional law professor walked the jury through the Fourth Amendment protections that had been shattered that Tuesday morning. The defense case lasted less than 2 days. Neither defendant took the stand, probably on advice from their lawyers who knew their clients would be destroyed under cross-examination. Character witnesses tried to paint both officers as good men who had made mistakes, but their testimony rang hollow against the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was swift and complete. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. Officer Reeves was convicted on 7 federal charges. Officer Thompson was convicted on 6. The maximum combined sentence they faced was over 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Family members of other victims wept openly. Judge Williams sat quietly in the front row, showing no emotion but clearly vindicated. The defendants' families looked devastated, finally understanding that their loved ones were going to prison for a very long time. But the criminal convictions were just the beginning of the consequences these officers would face. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Federal Judge Robert Chen, no relation to the prosecutor, had reviewed every piece of evidence and every victim impact statement. He had presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but he said this case stood out for the brazenness of the constitutional violations and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendants. Judge Williams was allowed to give a victim impact statement before sentencing. She stood at the podium and spoke directly to both defendants who couldn't meet her eyes. She told them that their actions hadn't just violated her rights, but had damaged the relationship between law enforcement and the community. She said their behavior had made it harder for good officers to do their jobs and had reinforced the worst stereotypes about police racism. She also spoke about the broader impact of their crimes. Every black citizen who heard about this case would wonder if they were safe in their own neighborhoods, their own homes. Every parent would have to explain to their children why some police officers might see them as threats simply because of their skin color. Her statement lasted 20 minutes and left the courtroom in complete silence when she finished. Judge Chin sentenced Officer Reeves to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Officer Thompson received 12 years. Both men would serve their time in federal facilities far from their home state for their own protection as much as anything else. Convicted police officers don't fare well in prison, and everyone in the system knew it. The sentences sent shock waves through law enforcement nationwide. 15 years for a single incident of racial profiling was unprecedented. Legal experts called it a watershed moment that would change how officers thought about their actions. Police unions condemned the sentences as excessive, but civil rights groups hailed them as long overdue accountability. The civil lawsuit settled 3 weeks after the criminal sentencing. The city agreed to pay Judge Williams $12 million, the largest individual settlement for police misconduct in the state's history. The insurance company that had canceled the city's coverage was forced to pay the settlement under their previous policy, then immediately filed their own lawsuit against the city for failing to address known problems. But money was just one part of the comprehensive settlement Judge Williams negotiated. The agreement required the police department to implement sweeping reforms under federal oversight. Every officer would undergo extensive bias training. Complaint procedures would be completely overhauled with civilian oversight. Body cameras would be mandatory for all interactions with the public. Most importantly, the settlement created a civilian review board with real power to investigate misconduct and discipline officers. Judge Williams insisted on serving as the first chair of this board, using her position to ensure meaningful change. The other victims who had been targeted by Reeves and Thompson filed their own lawsuits. Over the next year, the city paid out an additional $38 million in settlements. The financial strain forced massive budget cuts and led to the resignation of the mayor, police chief, and 3 city council members who had ignored years of warning signs. Officer Reeves began serving his sentence at a federal facility in another state. Within his first month, he was attacked by inmates who recognized him from news coverage. He spent the remainder of his sentence in protective custody, essentially solitary confinement for 15 years. His wife divorced him after 6 months and moved across the country with their children. Officer Thompson's experience was similar. 12 years of isolation, family destruction, and the knowledge that his racism had cost him everything. Both men would emerge from prison as convicted felons, unemployable and notorious. The police department they left behind was transformed beyond recognition. Federal oversight meant every policy, every procedure, every hire had to be approved by Justice Department monitors. The culture of protecting bad officers was replaced by strict accountability measures. Complaint investigations were conducted by independent civilian investigators rather than fellow officers. Training programs were completely redesigned with input from civil rights organizations and community groups. Officers learned not just about constitutional law, but about implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community policing strategies. The goal was to fundamentally change how officers viewed their role in the community. The changes weren't universally popular within the department. Veteran officers complained about increased scrutiny and paperwork. Some retired early rather than adapt to the new standards. But recruitment improved dramatically as the department's reputation began to recover, and more diverse candidates applied to join a reform force. Judge Williams continued serving on the federal bench, but her experience had changed her perspective on the cases that came before her courtroom. She became known for asking tough questions during police misconduct cases and for ensuring that constitutional violations carried real consequences. 3 years after the incident at her home, she was invited to speak at the FBI Academy about police accountability. Her message to new agents was simple but powerful. The law applies to everyone equally, and those who swear to uphold it must be held to the highest standards when they violate it. The case became a landmark in civil rights law studied in law schools and policemized as an example of what happens when racism meets accountability. The security footage from Judge Williams' home was used in training programs nationwide to show officers exactly what constitutional violations look like and what consequences they carry. But perhaps the most important impact was on the community itself. Residents who had suffered in silence for years now knew their complaints would be taken seriously. The Civilian Review Board, Judge Williams, helped create investigated every allegation thoroughly and published detailed reports of their findings. The message was clear. Racial profiling would not be tolerated, regardless of who was targeted or who was doing the targeting. Justice had finally come to a community that had been waiting far too long for accountability. Too long for accountability. Two officers thought they could intimidate someone they saw as powerless, someone who wouldn't fight back or couldn't hold them accountable. They were catastrophically wrong. Judge Patricia Williams proved that actions have consequences, that evidence matters, and that even federal judges aren't immune to the prejudice that plagues our justice system. Her courage to fight back didn't just destroy 2 careers and send 2 men to prison for 15 years. It transformed an entire police department and sent a message that echoed nationwide. Sometimes justice is slow. Sometimes it's uncertain. But when brave people stand up and fight for what's right, it can be absolutely devastating to those who thought they were untouchable. This case was intense. But this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.